Dear friends, today on Think BRICS, we are joined by Bolivian journalist Oliver Vargas, co-founder of Causacho News and an expert on Latin American politics, to unpack the stunning shift in Bolivia's recent elections and its far-reaching impact on the future of BRICS and Latin America's geopolitical landscape. Hello, Oli. Thank
Hello,
you.
thank you very much for having me on.
Thank you for coming. It's great to have you here, especially from Bolivia, which has been a BRICS partner since January. Well, let's start an explanation of the current event so our audience understands what's happening in Bolivia. Could you please describe the political and social dynamics that led to the recent surprising election results in Bolivia?
Yeah, Bolivia just had elections this past Sunday, and after 20 years of the main party of the left, which is called the Movement Towards Socialism, winning every election since 2005, for the first time they have lost an election. In fact, not only lost it, but been entirely wiped out, reduced to 3%. And now Bolivia will have a second round of voting between two conservative right wing candidates who will, undoubtedly undo many of the big structural changes that Bolivia has seen over the last 20 years, both domestically and in its foreign policy. And it, although it is surprising to see the figures of the scale of the collapse of the ruling party, um, in reality, it was something that has been brewing for at least 3 or 4 years due to the internal splits within the ruling party. There's currently now split three different ways, at least three different ways, um, and it was that climate of internal split that's created a state of chaos within Bolivian politics, and which has in turn contributed massively to economic problems in the country. And it's those economic problems really that turned a lot of voters away from the ruling party. And now we see the result that we've seen for the first time. The the Movement Towards Socialism party, which was hegemonic for over 20 years, is now does no longer have even any representation in Congress. And we will see a sharp shift now in Bolivian politics.
Thanks. Uh, Can we define the rural and indigenous boycott movement choice as a political suicide?
Yeah, so as I mentioned just a moment ago, the ruling party, the Movement Towards Socialism, that was essentially a coalition for many years, a coalition between rural, indigenous movements, along with workers' unions, along with some sections of what I would call the progressive middle class, a kind of a coalition, a broad front coalition, um, but fundamentally led by the rural indigenous movements, and which in Bolivia, which has the largest indigenous population of any country in Latin America, um, they were an incredibly powerful force, and they were especially felt very represented by the ex-president Evo Morales, who governed for 14 years and was the president of the party up until up until 2 years ago. What happens in 2020 is Evo Morales is no longer president, and a successor takes over, the current president, Luis Arce, and there begins to be a factional a clash between those who support Evo Morales and those who support Luis Arce. And those around the current president, Luis Arce, are the more sort of middle class, urban middle class faction within that party. And those around Evo Morales are more the rural indigenous voters. Now, during the course of this faction fight, President Luis Arce decides that it will be settled through banning Evo Morales, expelling Morales from the party, banning him from standing. And over the past few years, there have been a number of social conflicts around that, and in which the government has also used the state as well to bring an end to those protests. And many of those indigenous movements see the government as having repressed those protests. So, um, in light of that, in light of that split, many of those voters no longer felt represented by the Movement Towards Socialism party, and there begins to be a split from them. And they felt that they weren't represented in the election, that they didn't have a candidate that represented them in the election. They decided to not vote. They decided to spoil their ballots. And in the rural areas, that won with a landslide, 80 to 90%. In the cities, much less.
Mhm.
So, is that political suicide? Depends. I'm sure everyone would have an opinion on it. I think a principle of electoral politics would be that no one, uh, political parties aren't owed votes by any constituency. No one owes you their vote. Parties should win votes rather than demand votes. And when a party is not able to attract votes, is the responsibility of the party, not of the voter
Of course.
who turned away from them.
If we are not talking about political suicide, but it's deep crisis.
Yes, exactly, and a crisis, an institutional crisis, which I think began at the top, among the higher echelons of political power, and not from the bases, the social movements that the party used to represent. Um, but yeah, this is a process of fragmentation, political fragmentation that we see actually all across Latin America. Um, stoked by media wars, stoked by external factors as well. But this process of disunity within a lot of the parties of the left in Latin America has massively weakened them in almost every country, actually.
What do you think are the immediate political and social consequences of the rise of right wing candidates in Bolivia?
Well, I think we should be clear that there hasn't been a massive shift to the right within uh, within the Bolivian electorate. In the last election, for example, the main right wing candidate Carlos Mesa received 25% of the vote, and now the the right wing candidate who came in first place, called Rodrigo Paz, got around 31%. So we don't see a landslide for any right wing candidate. What we've seen is a failure of the ruling party, and the opposition, right wing opposition, kind of winning by default and filling the political void. But not without the enthusiasm and momentum the previous governments have had. But the consequences will be very clear. There are two candidates who will be going into into the runoff. Both are standing on um, policies really similar to what people may recognize as having been promoted by Javier Milei in Argentina, free market policies, social austerity, privatization of state industries, and in foreign policy, a turn towards the United States and a turn away from Bolivia's current allies, which are countries like China, such as Russia, Venezuela, Cuba, and others. I think those are things we're going to see with both candidates, and that will be the immediate consequences. Whether that setup, and one of them will be president in a few months' time, whether whoever wins that second round runoff will be able to govern for 5-10 years, I think remains to be seen. I think actually the support the stability of that government will be very weak. As I said, in Bolivians, no candidate got above around 30% of the vote, and the seats in Congress are distributed according to your presidential vote. So therefore, there will be a crisis of governability. They'll have to form coalitions, which can very easily break down, especially in the face of social protests, which we're definitely going to see as a consequence in the coming months. So I think we should keep an eye on Bolivia. I don't think that this is a final defeat or a final victory for any one party or side or movement.
I see, thank you. But if we are talking about foreign policy, what changes might be on the cards for Bolivia's foreign policy under the new leadership, especially when it comes to its relationship with BRICS coalition. Do you think Bolivia will end up following Argentina's lead?
Um, I think it depends which of the two candidates wins. There are two candidates currently in the runoff. One, as I mentioned, who came in first place, Rodrigo Paz, who is attempting to portray himself as a bit as more inclusive, as further in the center, and then a more right wing candidate called Jorge Quiroga, who is actually an ex president of Bolivia. He came in second place, and he'll be on the ballot paper for the second round. He is entirely a product of Washington. He has worked in the United States for many years since leaving the presidency years ago. His foreign policies will be entirely written by the U.S. Embassy in Bolivia. He's already stated during the campaign that he plans to reposition Bolivia, to realign Bolivia with the United States and Israel. And I think there's no doubt that Bolivia would formally leave BRICS if he were the president. Um, However, with the candidate that's currently in first place, Rodrigo Paz, I don't believe that Bolivia will formally leave. They will attempt to balance their relationships, both um, rebuilding the relationship with the United States and realigning towards the United States, but they'll intend to not break the bridges that have been built with, for example, with China, with Russia, and others. But I think we'll see a massive cooling in that relationship. Those relationships will no longer be strategic relationships, and that will be something that will come from on orders of the United States. But I think that Rodrigo Paz, who will probably win, has shown himself as someone who's trying to balance all sides. Of course, in practice, no one can balance all sides. Well, those who've tried to balance all sides have not ended up doing so. So I think we will see, at best, a massive cooling of relationships with BRICS countries, and at worst, a formal exit um, uh, from the organization.
Thank you. But beyond Bolivia's relationship with BRICS, how do you see the recent political shift affecting its movement in Mercosur, another Latin American regional organization, and key infrastructural projects like the China backed Bioceanic Corridor?
Well, one um, thing that I think the United States is very keen on at the moment is trying to break down any kind of Latin American integration, as well as, of course, breaking down the relationships that Latin America has with countries like Russia and China and others. Um, and in the case of, for example, Brazil, moving towards a situation of almost sanctions, and I think we probably will get there in the coming year at some point. So when we have a government that responds to the interests of the United States, again, I think Bolivia will stop pursuing the path of integration in things like Mercosur, in things like these big cross-border infrastructure projects that will have cooperation with China and others, and that'll be massively detrimental. And I think we have to remember that there's been huge benefits that have come to Bolivia through cooperation with BRICS countries, whether that be through the Belt and Road Initiative, funding numerous infrastructure and electrification projects in Bolivia, or, for example, in the case of Russia, massive cooperation on the issue of nuclear science, not for nuclear weapons, but for nuclear medicine. So actually, Bolivia has a number of nuclear medicine centers to treat cancer that was built in cooperation with Rosatom, with Russia, which provides free treatment to cancer patients in Bolivia for the first time. Before, if you getting cancer in Bolivia meant either you had to have lots of money for private treatment abroad in other countries such as Brazil or the United States, or you would almost certainly succumb to the disease if you didn't have the funds to do that. And now many people have access to that kind of medicine for the first time thanks to cooperation with Russian and BRICS countries. So we will see a lot of these projects, I think, begin to wind down, unfortunately. Um, uh, but you know, the argument will have to be made about the importance of this cooperation, and we'll see if the United States allows the incoming government to maintain this cooperation. I strongly suspect that they will not, and actually, the strategy of Trump's State Department will be to wind down these relationships, to force countries to wind down these relationships.
Well, there are projects not only nuclear medicine, but about lithium as well. That's why
Yeah,
Bolivia was very interesting for BRICS. Like, I don't know if it's correct to say the source of lithium, but it was.
absolutely. Lithium, of course, Bolivia has some of the large lithium reserves anywhere in the world. Um, I failed to mention just now, almost through kind of not on purpose, just because it's kind of fallen out of the public discourse, unfortunately, just at a lack of progress over the last few years. I think there's been a lot of wrangling, unfortunately, over contracts, over how the lithium will be industrialized, which has always been the government's plan. There's been very slow progress, which has itself contributed, I think, to the Bolivia's economic problems, which is why voters have voted the way they have. Um, but the plan for the lithium has always been to industrialize it within Bolivia in cooperation with Chinese companies, with Russian companies, and others. Um, Unfortunately, there's been very slow progress on that, and that will mean now that there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that whoever wins the next elections, there will be an upending of those contracts. Those contracts will not be honoured. They will. The plan to industrialize, to build industrialized plants, to build value-added products, batteries, etc., will no longer be the case. They'll begin to export the lithium as a raw material, which of course is means a lower income for the country, and most likely to the United States. There's many interests there that have long sought Bolivia's lithium and are already accessing, for example, Argentina's lithium reserves, and they'll seek to extend the same for Bolivia, building a kind of corridor between Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, which is entirely dominated by Western interests. That will be the plan. As I said, whether they're able to develop that plan and implement it and execute it will depend on how long the government is able to govern. I do believe that the government that is incoming will be very unstable, and Bolivia is a country that has a long history of uprisings, and I think perhaps we could see any incoming government not necessarily serve out their full term. So we'll have to monitor that situation. But in the short to medium term, we will certainly see an abandonment of the current plans to industrialize the lithium reserves.
Thank you. In my opinion, Western-led governments in Bolivia will do their best to to push away BRICS core member states from Bolivia. I mean, China and Russia. That's for sure. They will do that.
Yes, absolutely. And I think one thing I would add though is, example, Javier Milei in Argentina
Yeah.
pledged to do that. He claimed that he would actually cut all relations with China and Russia. In power, he hasn't actually done that. In power, he realized the necessity of cooperation with many BRICS countries, and he's had to sort of quietly try to rebuild relationships there. But it has been massively dialed back, and that's what we'll see, I believe, in Bolivia, particularly if the candidate Jorge Quiroga wins. We will see a formal exit from BRICS in the way we've seen with Argentina. But and we'll begin to see as well a demonization of China and Russia in Bolivian media to sort of prepare the ground for this. But yeah, I think you're right.
What lessons can be learned from Bolivia's political change regarding the future of BRICS in Latin America's geopolitical landscape, and what suggestions would you offer to move forward?
Well, I think we shouldn't focus purely on the current moment. Bolivia's had has been in what is called the process of change, which is what the mass party calls the past 20 years. It's been in this for over 2 decades, and in that time, particularly during Evo Morales' term in office, Bolivia went from being the poorest country in South America into its fastest growing economy. And it did that through nationalization of natural resources, reinvesting those revenues into social development, building cooperation with what should be Bolivia's natural allies, both in the region with countries like Venezuela and Cuba and others, as well as with countries like China and Russia. And it was these are big structural changes that democratized the country, that brought development to the country, and the macroeconomic indicators, I think, are really important. It shouldn't be forgotten by history. Poverty was cut in half. Extreme poverty was cut by more than half. When Evo Morales came into power in 2005, 67% of the country lived below the UN defined poverty line. By the time he left office in 2019, that was around 30%. These are things that massively have transformed people's lives through the policies that I just mentioned, and that shouldn't be something that's forgotten by history. But then, in terms of lessons of how this can come apart, how such important changes can begin to disintegrate, I think people have to acknowledge both sort of external factors and but also internal factors. The way that um, sort of jealous factional interests over who gets what portions of the state can sometimes have massive consequences for the country. The divisions within parties of government, unnecessary divisions over personal ambitions can sometimes have gigantic consequences. But also, how do parties deal with the changing demographics and class compositions within their countries? Because I think one achievement of Bolivia, as I said, has been to lift millions of people out of poverty. Many of those people enter the middle class and then no longer identify now with governments of the left or working class parties. So how do you deal with that? I don't think there's an easy solution to that, and I think yeah, there could probably be many academic conferences held to discuss this issue. But these are realities of how the shifts in the structures of society can also have big consequences at election times over a long period of time, and these are all things we have to analyze.
Thank you, Oliver. Um, Under our article on Substack that I invite you all to follow and to read, there is a comment that I would like you to comment on. That the comment left by Mr. Perez. I would say that the left point about this issue is very problematic in a country like Bolivia. We Bolivians do not have nor had a real left political option, and those governments who called themselves socialists were a little too much neoliberals. Of course, that the fact of being pushing towards the BRICS side was important, but the fact is that the politics of Morales and Archer were very much more like those of Milei in Argentina, a small state at the service of a few. Don't get me wrong, I'm sure things are going to be worse with the new administration, but not too much worse.
I think that's a very very poor analysis in terms of um, to compare the governments of, for example, Evo Morales to Javier Milei. I think is it would be very reductive. Um, there is not a small state in Bolivia. Evo Morales nationalized the country's principal natural resources, which are the largest sections of the economy. So that's natural gas, most sections of mining, as well as telecommunications, things like airlines and numerous other things. And it turned the state into the force that directed the economy. Of course, the private sector still existed, and was still very large, but the principal sections of the economy were under public control and were integrated into a national development plan. I think it's certainly true that the efficiency of that plan began to wane in the last few years, which is why we've seen economic difficulties. But it was very successful for much longer than it wasn't, and one would only have to listen to Javier Milei's own view on Evo Morales and the Bolivian government to say that it would be wrong to compare the two. What we're seeing now in Argentina is a process of privatization of all of those industries that Evo Morales brought into the state sector. We're seeing massive social austerity rather than social programs and development of infrastructure that we saw on Evo Morales. So, of course, these are two very different approaches. There has been criticisms that perhaps government Evo Morales or Luis Arce could have gone a lot further, could have done more, should have done greater social programs, greater investment in infrastructure, expand the state sector, and I think those are perfectly valid. But what one cannot say is that they led a retreat of the state, that they didn't have the state as a motor of the economy. That objectively they did.
Oliver, thank you very much. Now we definitely know better the political background of Bolivia, and thank you for coming, because it's first time we have Bolivian journalists here on Think BRICS. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on Bolivia's election and what it means for BRICS and Latin America. Hope you liked it. And we would love to have you back on our channel. And before we wrap up, could you please let our viewers know where they can follow you and your work to stay updated on Latin American news?
No, thank you very much for having me on. I think it's very important, the work you guys are doing and exploring these issues, particularly with regards to BRICS. I think there's not enough discussion and analysis. So yeah, thank you for your work. And yeah, in terms of where you can find more information and discussion about Latin America, you can follow my own account on Twitter. I'm at Ollie Vargas 79. You can also follow Calcetra News at Calcetra News. And yeah, I think hopefully we can. I think we, all of us, both of us here, are shedding a lot of light on things that need to be discussed more. So that's very positive.
Thank you so much. Dear friends, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Think BRICS if you are new here. Thanks for watching.